Hello, everyone, and a very warm welcome to this explainer. I am so incredibly glad you're here with us today. We are about to take a really fascinating visual journey through one of the most dynamic periods in North American history. We're going to trace the dramatic transformation of Canada, looking at how it went from this fractured, war-torn continent of rival empires into a single, unified dominion. If you love seeing how historical dots connect to create the world we know today, well, you are in the exact right place. Okay, let's dive into this. Here is our roadmap for today. We'll be covering the struggle for the continent, the Quebec Act, the arrival of the United Empire Loyalists, the War of 1812, and finally, the birth of the Dominion. Let's start right off with our first major theme, the struggle for a continent. I want you to picture the mid-1700s. North America was essentially a massive chessboard, and the two biggest players in the game, France and Great Britain, were locked in a fierce, high-stakes rivalry for ultimate control. And the balance of power shifted with just breathtaking speed. Throughout the early 1700s, the tensions and skirmishes between the French and the British really intensified. But the true turning point happened in 1759, which led directly to the Treaty of Paris just 4 years later in 1763. It's wild to think about, but the map of North America was practically redrawn in the span of just half a decade. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is just how different these two empires were before that turning point. On the French side, you had this sprawling, massive fur trade economy. It was vast, stretching all the way from Hudson Bay down to the Gulf of Mexico, and it relied really heavily on alliances with First Nations. On the British side, their colonies were physically much smaller, clustered right along the Atlantic seaboard, but they were significantly richer and packed with a lot more people. So you've got two completely different strategies for holding a continent, and they were absolutely destined to collide. That collision reached its absolute peak in 1759 at the Battle of the Plains of Abraham, right outside Quebec City. The British Army, led by Brigadier James Wolfe, defeated the French army under the Marquis de Montcalm, and it was a brutal, brutal fight. Actually, both commanders were killed while leading their troops. But the outcome was decisive. This single battle marked the dramatic end of France's empire in America. Right after this, the Treaty of Paris in 1763 officially handed the territory over to Britain. Which brings us to a massive administrative headache for the British and our second section, the Quebec Act of 1774. Britain had just won the war, right? But now they had to figure out how on earth to govern a newly acquired colony made up almost entirely of a French-speaking Catholic majority. So in 1763, Great Britain renamed the colony the Province of Quebec. But the people living there, the Canadians, were determined to preserve their Catholic French way of life, even though they were now part of a Protestant-ruled British Empire. To ensure their loyalty, because Britain really needed it, they passed the Quebec Act in 1774. And just a bit later, in 1791, the Constitutional Act would come along and divide the region into Upper and Lower Canada. The Quebec Act was honestly groundbreaking for its time. First, it permitted religious freedom for Catholics. It also allowed them to hold public office, which is a huge deal, because that wasn't even allowed back in Britain at the time. Finally, it restored French civil law while keeping British criminal law in place. It was this remarkable piece of political accommodation, and it legally protected the French culture that is still flourishing in Canada today. But just 2 years after the Quebec Act, the continent was fractured by war yet again. Let's look at part 3, the arrival of the United Empire Loyalists. Down south in 1776, the 13 British colonies declared their independence, forming the United States. But here's the thing, not everyone wanted to rebel. A staggering 40,000 people fled the American Revolution. 40,000! They traveled north to settle in Nova Scotia and Quebec, and this massive wave of migration fundamentally changed the demographics of British North America practically overnight. And the diversity of these loyalists is just incredible. It wasn't only British settlers packing up and moving. You had people of Dutch, German, and Scandinavian descent. Crucially, Joseph Brant led thousands of loyalist Mohawk Indians up into Canada. Furthermore, about 3,000 Black loyalists, a mix of freedmen and slaves looking for a better life, also came north. This whole migration brought a rich, diverse tapestry of cultures that deeply, deeply influenced Canada's developing identity. As all these new communities were settling in, they soon found themselves forced to defend their new home. This brings us to Section 4, the War of 1812, the fight for Canada. The United States was really frustrated with British interference in their shipping, and they actually believed that conquering Canada would be an easy win. Well, they were very mistaken. The U.S. launched their invasion in June of 1812, but the pushback was immediate. By July, Major General Sir Isaac Brock actually captured Detroit. The very next year, in 1813, an overwhelming force of American invaders was stopped right in their tracks at Châteauguay, south of Montreal. And by 1814, the American attempt to conquer Canada had completely and totally failed. And this brilliantly illustrates exactly why that invasion failed. It was because of who stood against them. This wasn't just the British military fighting. You had British soldiers fighting right alongside First Nations warriors led by Chief Tecumseh. You had French Canadians like the soldiers led by Lieutenant Colonel Charles de Salaberry who won at Châteauguay, plus countless Canadian volunteers. It was this remarkable, unified defense by communities that might otherwise have been at odds with each other. The outcome of all that cooperation was absolutely vital. The War of 1812 ensured that Canada would remain completely independent of the United States. For sure, it solidified the fact that the territory north of the border was going to pursue its own unique political and cultural destiny. So we have this population that has been tested by war, is incredibly diverse, and is spread out over vast territories, but they are totally united in their desire to stay independent. The great question of the 19th century was, how do you take these divided, war-tested colonies and actually turn them into a single functional nation? The answer to that question is confederation. Let's step into our fifth and final section, the birth of the Dominion and the political road to 1867. Throughout the 1800s, populations in British North America were just booming, and their economic and defense needs were growing right alongside them. Leaders started to realize that joining together was literally the only way to build a stronger, self-sustaining society. So between 1864 and 1866, representatives met several times to hash out all the complicated details of a political union. And finally, all that hard work paid off when the British Parliament passed the British North America Act in 1867. The old province of Canada was split into two brand new provinces, Ontario and Quebec. Together with Nova Scotia and New Brunswick, they formed the first four provinces of this brand new country. The setup was that each province would elect its own legislature to control local matters, things like health and education, while a central federal government would handle the broader strokes of running the new nation. Leading this incredible charge was Sir John A. Macdonald, the very first Prime Minister of the Dominion of Canada. He was a real visionary. He understood that for this new country to survive, it needed to be physically linked together. So he became a massive champion of the Canadian Pacific Railway, with the big goal of connecting the nation all the way from the Atlantic coast over to the Pacific. But, Macdonald didn't do it alone. Sir George Etienne Cartier was just as vital to the whole process. A very patriotic Canadian, he was the key architect of Confederation from Quebec. Cartier successfully brought Quebec into the Union and played a massive role in negotiating the future entry of the Northwest Territories, Manitoba, and British Columbia into Canada. It was a true partnership built on compromise and a shared vision. So, the crucial point is that all of these centuries of struggle, the wars, the treaties, the migrations, and the political debates, they all built the foundation for a permanent democracy. And that democracy is beautifully symbolized today by the Parliament buildings in Ottawa, the true heart of the Dominion. And it all became official on this exact date, July 1st, 1867. The Dominion of Canada was born. It was an incredible achievement, really, a self-governing nation established not out of some sudden violent revolution, but through a long, gradual process of peaceful negotiation, diversity, and political compromise. But, as you might imagine, 1867 was really just day one. With the core foundation of a new nation set, the next massive challenge was already looming. How would this vast dominion actually expand its borders westward across such a rugged continent, and how would it gradually secure its total independence? Well, that is a phenomenal story, and it is exactly what we will uncover in our next explainer. Thank you so much for learning with me today, and I can't wait to see you next time as we continue to explore the incredible history of Canada.